Yeah, it's pathetic. It's
Yeah.
tragic, first and foremost, for Ukraine, which is really getting destroyed by all of this. It's completely shocking to me that nobody cares about making peace, only about how to beat Russia, which is something it's not going to happen. So there's a lot of naivete, there's a lot of lying, there's a lot of ignorance about what got us into this mess. But what is also shocking for me is that almost no leaders even have an impulse to find a peaceful way out of this. It's just not part of the public discourse in the Western world. Putin says, we're open for negotiation. All of the political leaders in the West say, there's no one to talk to. Putin says, we're open for negotiation. There's no one to talk to. It's a sick game.
Yeah.
And it's really disappointing. It's very sad for me. Must be even sadder for you. I regard my own government as filled with idiots, but I usually took it for granted that Europe was more sophisticated. Europe has not been more sophisticated at all.
No.
Europe has been absolutely pathetic during this whole period. Almost no European leader discusses the real history of this conflict, how it could be avoided. Everybody fakes it. So here's where we are, and the result is awful. And by the way, I said it would be awful on March 2022, that the U.S. approach would fail, as it has failed, because I'm an adult that has lived through one failure after another of the United States: Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, now Ukraine. Okay, come on. But Europe? Wake up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Professor, what is the role of the CIA of this?
Well, basically, there is a U.S. policy to expand NATO, and unfortunately, some of the Dutch politicians, like your outgoing prime minister, have been among the most enthusiastic. And it's been a dangerous venture for the past 30 years, a cheat, a destabilization. And CIA is part of it, meaning that it's a pretty deep state approach in that it crosses party lines. It's year after year. It's never expressed so vividly on the surface, but it's everywhere to be seen if you look for it. And this is where we are. 30 years ago, the United States said, we're the sole superpower of the world, and we're going to do what we want. One of the things we want to do is expand NATO everywhere. So they just started the Eastern expansion despite promises to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin that NATO would not expand even 1 inch eastward. But Americans don't keep their word because we're the empire. We can do what we want. So the expansion started. By the time we got to 2007, after which there had already been NATO enlargement to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Bulgaria. And then the U.S. said, okay, now we go to Ukraine and to Georgia. And the Russians said, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Did you look at a map? First of all, is Georgia really the North Atlantic? Second, didn't you say not 1 inch to the east? Third, wasn't NATO about protecting you from the Soviet Union, which doesn't even exist anymore? And so they said, stop. The United States said, we don't hear you. We have no red lines. We don't have to listen to you. You're a second-rate power. Shut up. And that's 12 years ago, and that has been our approach until today. And I suspect that some European leaders actually know this, but don't voice it. The only ones that speak the truth, in my experience right now, are Viktor Orban, who is outside of the acceptable in Europe because he tells the truth. Now Roberto Fico in Slovakia because he tells the truth. But politicians that I know in Western Europe that really were absolutely aghast at George Bush pushing NATO to Ukraine back in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, they don't say a word right now. And I know these people personally, and I resent it because they're putting me at risk. They're putting you at risk.
Yeah, everybody.
Yeah, definitely. But is there some kind of explanation to what? Because I was born in the 60s, so when I take a look back in the 80s, we had this peace movement in Europe. We had the left-wing politicians that were protesting against the danger of the nuclear catastrophe. And how come that the last, we could say, years, there is hardly any counter movement visible in Europe or in the Netherlands? You don't see in the mainstream media not a fundamental discussion on what the process it exactly is that led to this situation. So, do you have any explanation that we're in this, you could say, situation right now regarding the public domain and the political domain? What happened to us?
I think the whole West.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you something about the U.S., which is quite easy, which is there's no draft. It's not Americans. It's Ukrainians dying on the ground. And as long as it's Ukrainians dying and the Americans don't have to pay any tax for this because it's all put on debt. So it's not actually funded in our budget. It's just adding to the debt.
Of course.
You don't really have public protest. People don't like it. The American public's against all of this. But by the way, nobody asked the American public anything about this. This is a top-down executive branch, deep state mission. Congress doesn't say anything about it in the United States. Now, that's the basic reason that there's not mobilization, because all of this can be done with a bit of propaganda, adding to the debt, and no known American soldiers on the ground. Though, of course, there are many, but not boots on the ground, as we say in fighting battalions. In Europe, truly, it's weird. European leaders have put Europe at risk. Europe is in an economic recession as a result of all of this. Europe stood by when America blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Every European leader lied about it. Who the hell do you think did it? Of course the United States did it. They said they would do it. They did it. And yet even the Germans don't talk about it. And it's their pipeline. It's their economy down the drain. So there is something really sad about all of this, and very dangerous, because none of it makes any deep sense. And where are European politicians even saying, well, we should speak to Putin about this, we should negotiate, we should try to find a way out? They're not even saying that. Who's the most militaristic of all in Europe? It's the so-called chief diplomat, Borrell. A diplomat. He's zero diplomacy. He's all for war mobilization. The head of the European Commission, van der Leyen, can't tell the difference of being the head of the Commission and being the head of NATO, because she really craves being the head of NATO. So there's just a complete confusion, and the European politicians fell into line with this and have done a real disservice to the people of the European Union.
But Professor, perhaps it's a very simple question, but why?
Why? I don't know why. I know why the U.S. is doing it. That's clear, because the U.S. is filled with an arrogant mindset that the U.S. runs the world. I know that, and I know that in detail. This is the mindset since the end of the Cold War. But why Europe goes along with this, that's just a big disappointment for me. I don't understand it. I have several people that I know well in European leadership, and they're silent.
Hey, you know Macron very well. So what does Macron tell you then?
Well, he tells me different things in private from what he says in public. So, I can't make sense of it. He's playing a political game, but the stakes are too high for that. Maybe he thinks this is good politics. Maybe it's important, he thinks, before the European elections. I don't know why, but none of it makes sense. And what can you make sense that he saber rattles for days and then he says, now we need a ceasefire during the Paris Olympics? Is that how you would get it? If instead he had said, in the interest of peace, we need a ceasefire during the Olympics, not saying we have no red lines, Putin's the enemy, we have to fight to the finish, and all the things he said in the weeks before, then it would make sense. So none of it makes sense to me. I know him well, yes. He gave me the Legion of Honor. But I don't get it from the real point of view of what are the European leaders thinking? Why can't they get together and do what's good for Europe? Which is to tell the Americans, back off, to say to Putin, NATO's not enlarging, but we need peace on this continent. We need this war to end. And have a real discussion about that. It's possible. I speak to the Russians all the time. I speak to Europeans all the time. It's possible to talk. But we don't even have the functionality of trying to talk right now. They don't go, they don't discuss, they don't have meetings. When I was invited to the G20 to speak to the foreign ministers a couple of years ago, the Western so-called foreign ministers wouldn't even speak with Lavrov. What is this? We're grown-ups. We have big stakes. We need to talk with each other. So no, I don't accept it. I think it's not grown-up behavior.
Maybe it has something to do with the situation, I think, and in the 90s that we were talking about this new American century in the unipolar world in which the Western values would become dominant and all over the world. Of course, you had this idea of let's say Samuel Huntington. You would say now modernization is not the same as Westernization, was a central claim, and sometimes it feels like in Europe we don't have the capacity right now to really accept that there is an alternative to a Western global order.
Well,
like there's
first
a kind
of all,
of panic that we're really entering this multipolar order. How do you look at that?
Well, first of all, I kind of choke on the words Western values because I come from a country that's been in nonstop war my whole lifetime. So I know what the values are. Yeah, the values are the values of imperialism. The U.S. has 800 military bases around the world. It's involved in nonstop wars. It's wars of choice. These are wars of choice, have killed millions of people. So the whole idea of Western values is pablum. I
understand, but we talk that.
Well, I want to put that part aside. Now, just a few years ago, I actually believed in the European Union values of sustainable development, the European Green Deal. I'm a big fan of Franz Timmermans because of his commitment to sustainable development, and I've known him for a long time. I thought those were the European values, and they should be. And Europe was ahead of the world curve on important issues like environmental sustainability or social democracy, by the way, which is actually a European invention that has worked very well to give excellent living standards for people across society and to raise life expectancy to the highest levels in the world and so forth. Those are not the values of NATO. Come on, NATO's about war. Those are not the values of the CIA. The CIA is about U.S. Unipolarity, U.S. hegemony. That's the explicit mission. Topple governments that you don't like, topple governments that stand in the way of U.S. military bases or that stand in the way of pipelines in the places that we want them, or for whatever other reason. Those aren't European values. And Europe is a big place, got 450 million people. It's a huge economy. It's got good values. The mistake of Europe, really the sad mistake, was to confuse the European Union and NATO. And not only to confuse them, but to let them become exactly the same thing, almost literally now the same thing. That's a mistake, because the European Union was a union of countries to stop wars and to promote human values. It really was. And it made remarkable progress. NATO is an alliance to serve American primacy or hegemony or whatever, unipolarity, whatever term you want. It's completely different. But that's not Europe's mission in the world.
And so, at the same time, the European politicians were very glad with this coup in 2014, even on the Maidan Square. They even participated in it. So they already had this idea of making this connection between Ukraine and Europe, and even connecting it to some way to NATO.
No, that's absolutely true. And the 2014 coup was deeply cynical. You know, Americans paid for those people out on the streets to a large extent. America's riled it up. But, you know, European leaders were kind of giddy. Oh, we're going to get Ukraine into our orbit. And so the European leaders were really greedy in this too. Maybe they didn't think exactly in the U.S. hegemonic sense, but they thought, oh, a big prize is about to fall into our lap. And so Europe was dishonest, really dishonest. And here we have a tape of Victoria Nuland weeks before the coup, describing how it's all going to go down, including fuck the Europeans. Excuse my language, but it's Victoria Nuland.
Yeah. We know the tape. Yeah,
I know. Yeah. Where's Europe? No problem. That's all fine. That's all fine and dandy. Nothing happened. Nothing to look at. Come on. You see it in front of you. You hear it in front of you. I happen to see some of it firsthand. So it raises a question. What the hell are we doing overthrowing a government in Ukraine? Is that really going to be good for Ukraine? Is that really, quote, Western values? Is that really how we're going to prudentially make peace in Europe? But then, of course, our newspapers hide all of it. And the more mainstream the newspaper, the more pathetic it is. I can't even look at the New York Times anymore because it's not a grown-up newspaper.
It's the same in the Netherlands. I think it's the same in the West. Newspapers also do a very bad job. That Nuland step back, is that a positive sign? How do you see that?
Yeah, it's a good sign. Unfortunately, we have to pay a little local price. She's coming to Columbia University, of all places in the world. But
to get a
exactly. That's okay. You know, we had a discussion among colleagues. It's worth it to get her out of Washington. But yeah, it's some sign, I think, that even Washington has realized that this was just one escapade too far. You know, a lot of Washington gambits go really badly. And when you have lived a lifetime of the government lying about what it's doing, and then you watch it unfold, and then it turns bad. Iraq is the same way. Syria is the same way, by the way. Europe doesn't even understand to this day what went down in Syria. But Syria was a CIA operation to overthrow Assad. clear as day, a standard covert regime change operation that led to a massive refugee crisis in Europe and all the rest. Not a word of honesty about it in the European mainstream media. Well, Ukraine is the same thing. It's a project. It's a project of the United States. Let's get Ukraine into NATO. And then, of course, as we just said, the Europeans kind of were giddy. We're going to get them into the European Union too, and don't make these distinctions anymore. Well, it's gone sour, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Syria, like Libya, now like Ukraine. So here we are. So Nuland's leaving. Of course, it's a good sign.
Yeah, and the BRICS are expanding and become stronger and stronger. And Europe, we are here a little bit in between.
You know, Europe should be a major leading voice in the world for decency, peace, sustainable development, for helping other regions to understand how to make regional integration, for featuring the social democratic ethos and the sustainable development ethos. Europe would have a huge say in the world. Instead, Europe says, no, we'll play third fiddle to the U.S. military. And that's what's happened. So Europe has no role in the world right now other than being called to Washington to be given the next round of orders. And is Mark Rutte's highest aspiration to be NATO Secretary General? Probably. Why? What about being a European leader? What about being a leader that really helps Europe? Is Russia really going to roll over Western Europe? If anybody believes that, they live in a fantasy world. They don't understand anything. They don't understand anything about how to actually make peace, how to actually have normal relations. I was there when Gorbachev was president. I was there when Yeltsin was president. I was there when Kuchma was president in Ukraine. We had everything possible to have an open, peaceful relationship. And the United States blew it because the United States said, yes, on our terms, not on mutually respectful terms, but with U.S. domination. Okay, the Europeans should know this. They know about OSCE. They know about collective security. So let's have some European leaders that tell the truth.